Bonsoir. Madame l'ancienne présidente de la Confédération, Excellences, Madame la conseillère d'État, Monsieur le consul général, Monsieur le vice-président du conseil municipal de la ville de Genève, Monsieur le professeur, Monsieur le président, Mesdames et Messieurs les membres de la fondation Latsis, Mesdames les lauréates, chers et chers collègues des hautes écoles suisses, chers et chers collègues de l'Université de Genève, chers et chers invités, chers et chers amis, Mesdames, Messieurs, je suis très heureux de vous accueillir ce soir à l'Université de Genève et au nom des 4 institutions présentes, l'Université de Saint-Gall, l'École polytechnique fédérale de Lausanne, l'École polytechnique fédérale de Zurich et l'Université de Genève. Je tiens en tout premier lieu à remercier la Fondation Latsis qui soutient la relève académique dans nos institutions par l'intermédiaire de ces prix Latsis universitaires, mais aussi qui donne la possibilité à l'Université de Genève d'accueillir chaque année des oratrices et orateurs de renom qui partagent généreusement leur expertise et leur sagesse. Ce soir, nous aurons la chance d'écouter M. Kwame Appiah, professeur de philosophie et de droit à l'Université de New York et qui développera le thème éthique et politique des identités. À Genève, ville internationale qui abrite les Nations Unies et de nombreuses organisations internationales, l'ouverture au monde, la diversité et la multiplicité des identités sont des valeurs existentielles. À l'Université de Genève, nous faisons de ces valeurs des piliers de l'excellence académique, que ce soit dans la recherche, dans l'enseignement ou dans notre interaction avec la société. Quête rigoureuse de la vérité, intégrité, liberté académique, liberté d'expression, ainsi que responsabilité sociale, engagement envers notre planète et respect de chacune et chacun. Cette excellence académique est portée en Suisse par les hautes écoles et par des communautés estudiantines et de collaboratrices et collaborateurs qui sont diverses et en provenance de tous les horizons. Cette excellence académique constitue aussi l'un des grands moteurs du rayonnement scientifique exceptionnel de la Suisse et l'un des piliers de la prospérité du pays et de la qualité de vie dont jouit sa population. Il est donc aujourd'hui particulièrement perturbant de parfois constater qu'alors que les discours célèbrent l'ouverture au monde, la recherche, la formation, la réalité montre une tendance inverse, un repli sur soi et une réduction du soutien à la formation, à la recherche et à l'innovation. Et dans ce contexte, je tiens à remercier d'autant plus sincèrement et chaleureusement nos autorités cantonales pour leur soutien concret et indéfectible. Enfin, je souhaite remercier chaleureusement les 4 lauréates que nous honorons ce soir par leur dévouement au travail, leur engagement et leur contribution. Elles incarnent l'excellence académique de nos institutions et participent à cette grande aventure scientifique qui fonde le progrès au bénéfice de toutes et tous. Encore une fois, un grand merci à la Fondation Latsis pour son précieux soutien, à son président Yves Flukiger qui va maintenant prendre la parole, et bienvenue à toutes et tous. Je vous souhaite une soirée riche en échanges et en inspiration. Merci.
Les salutations protocolaires ayant été prononcées, je me permets de vous saluer, mesdames et messieurs, de manière succincte en vos titres et fonctions et de vous remercier surtout chaleureusement de votre présence nombreuse ce soir comme à chaque remise des prix Latsis à l'Université de Genève. C'est donc avec grand plaisir et un sentiment de profonde gratitude que je prends la parole ce soir à l'occasion de cette cérémonie organisée par l'Université de Genève. Je souhaite remercier tout d'abord l'équipe qui a œuvré à la préparation de cet événement, et en particulier Mme Sophie Hulot pour son travail dévoué, son engagement et son énergie inépuisable pour nous permettre de célébrer les lauréates ce soir des prix Latsis et d'accueillir en marge de cette remise des prix un conférencier de renom, M. Appiah, que nous aurons le plaisir tout à l'heure d'entendre. Sans vous, sans cette équipe d'organisation, cette cérémonie n'aurait pas l'éclat de ce soir. Je souhaite également saluer la présence de la conseillère d'État, Mme Annie Paul, qui nous fait l'amitié chaque année de venir à la remise des prix Latsis. C'est une présence importante pour l'Université de Genève et pour l'ensemble du monde académique suisse. Cette cérémonie est également l'occasion de célébrer une longue tradition, celle de la Fondation Latsis, et je salue les représentants, membres de la famille Latsis ce soir, celle de la Fondation Latsis qui décerne depuis 1983, donc la 42e édition ce soir, les prix Latsis aux universités de Genève, de Saint-Gall et aux écoles polytechniques fédérales de Lausanne et de Zurich. La mission de notre fondation, que j'ai l'honneur de présider, est de soutenir la relève académique, de donner un élan à des jeunes talents qui façonneront l'avenir de la recherche. C'est une tâche essentielle et nous sommes profondément engagés dans cette mission avec l'attribution non seulement de ces prix universitaires ce soir, mais aussi d'un prix Latsis national qui sera décerné à Berne dans quelques semaines en présence des autorités fédérales et de M. Parmelin en particulier. Je tiens également à remercier chaleureusement les commissions de recherche des 4 institutions primées sans lesquelles cette cérémonie ne serait pas possible. C'est grâce à leur expertise et à leur rigueur que les lauréates ont été sélectionnés. La participation active de ces commissions dans le processus de sélection renforce la légitimité et la valeur des prix qui seront remis ce soir. Cette année, nous avons l'immense joie de célébrer sans coordination 4 femmes lauréates. C'est une première dans l'histoire de la Fondation Latsis. Bravo, mesdames. C'est le reflet des progrès constants vers une plus grande diversité et une inclusion dans le monde académique. Et je suis convaincu que leurs recherches exceptionnelles contribueront à enrichir nos sociétés dans les années à venir. Les travaux des lauréates, que vous aurez l'occasion de découvrir dans quelques instants, sont particulièrement impressionnants. Ils couvrent des domaines très variés, qui vont de la physique quantique à la nanophotonique, en passant par la régulation des plateformes digitales ou la post-édition dans le champ de la traduction automatique. Ces recherches témoignent de la richesse de la recherche actuelle en Suisse et de l'importance de l'ouverture de notre pays aux talents venus du monde entier, un atout qu'il faut absolument préserver à l'heure où les discussions avec l'Union européenne sont à un tournant décisif, notamment pour le monde académique. L'engagement de nos lauréates, leur persévérance et leur esprit d'innovation méritent toute notre admiration. Je vous félicite chaleureusement pour ce prix qui, je l'espère, ne sera qu'une étape, qu'une première étape peut-être dans vos carrières qui seront brillantes, j'en suis absolument convaincu. Pour terminer, permettez-moi de tisser un lien entre cette première partie de la cérémonie et la suite de notre programme. Après avoir célébré les réalisations remarquables de nos lauréates, nous aurons le plaisir d'écouter un conférencier qui apportera un éclairage supplémentaire sur des thématiques qui résonnent profondément avec celles abordées par nos lauréates. Ainsi, cette cérémonie est non seulement une occasion de reconnaissance, mais également un moment de réflexion et d'inspiration pour nous toutes et tous. Merci à vous toutes et tous d'être présents ce soir, de votre attention, et j'ai le plaisir de passer maintenant la parole à Mme Annie Paul.
Mesdames et messieurs, en vos titres et fonctions, ça a été dit, ce n'est pas la première fois que je prends la parole à l'occasion du prix Latsis, mais j'aimerais vous dire que le plaisir est intact. Dans le contexte des rapports complexes entre notre pays et l'Union européenne, suite à la sortie de la Suisse du programme cadre pour la recherche et l'innovation Horizon Europe, de nombreux financements étaient perdus pour la recherche, ainsi que la possibilité de diriger des projets d'envergure internationale. Les mécanismes de financement nationaux, tels que les prix Latsis, sont devenus encore plus importants pour soutenir la recherche de haute qualité en Suisse. Et l'événement d'aujourd'hui est donc important et j'aimerais le saluer au nom du Conseil d'État. Ce rassemblement de ce soir est également l'occasion, de mon point de vue, de réaffirmer haut et fort les valeurs et les principes de la recherche scientifique. Respect des faits, précision et falsifiabilité des hypothèses, transparence des données et surtout, débat contradictoire soumis à la contrainte du meilleur argument. Il faut réaffirmer tout cela encore et encore, sans jamais faiblir, car ces valeurs et ces principes sont partout remis en question, voire frontalement attaqués. Dans le monde occidental, ces contestations viennent de tous les bords politiques et trahissent une évolution préoccupante de nos mœurs intellectuelles et de notre rapport à la vérité. Elles viennent parfois de la droite radicale qui tente de canceller, comme on dit aujourd'hui en dialecte global, des livres jugés incompatibles avec une morale sexuelle étroite. Il y a de ce point de vue une épidémie de mise à l'index dans les bibliothèques publiques américaines. Elles viennent parfois aussi de la gauche radicale qui tente de canceller des conférences insuffisamment wokistes ou des colloques insuffisamment décoloniaux. Quelle que soit leur provenance, cependant, ces attaques partagent une caractéristique commune. C'est très souvent au nom de l'identité qu'on refuse le débat argumenté et l'expression d'opinions opposées à ses propres croyances. Si bien qu'au fond, à gauche et à droite, des acteurs crispés sur une conception statique et close de leur identité chantent le même refrain. Nous ne voulons pas vous entendre car vous manquez de respect pour nos identités blessées. Et toute hypothèse scientifique court le risque d'offenser une communauté, petite ou grande, qui veille avec jalousie sur ce qu'elle considère comme une identité intangible dont la sensibilité doit s'imposer à toutes et tous. Et brimer la parole, si besoin, par souci de confort identitaire. Si le respect et la tolérance mutuelle sont essentiels, la discussion franche reste indispensable. Je salue donc également le professeur Kwame Anthony Appiah, inlassable critique des conceptions simplistes et monolithiques de l'identité. Il nous rappelle depuis des années, en effet, que les identités peuvent nous fermer aux différences, transformant par exemple le nationalisme en xénophobie. La suridentification à une seule étiquette peut en outre éteindre dans nos cœurs les sentiments de la solidarité envers celles et ceux qui revendiquent d'autres labels identitaires. Le choix de cette conférence, en définitive, témoigne que la Fondation Latsis et l'Université de Genève ont saisi l'importance des politiques de l'identité dans le succès contemporain de la censure, de la cancel culture, du refus de débattre et de la cécité aux faits. Et j'interprète également pour ma part ce choix comme une alerte et comme une mise en garde, on ne peut plus pertinente. Alors pour conclure, je remercie chaleureusement la Fondation Latsis pour la tenue de ce prix essentiel. Je remercie l'Université de Genève pour l'excellence de son travail et l'étendue de son rayonnement scientifique. Et avec un peu d'avance, je félicite chaleureusement les lauréates. Et je me réjouis de vous entendre, professeur Appiah. Vive les identités ouvertes et vive la recherche scientifique. Et merci pour votre attention.
Voilà, merci infiniment de ces paroles fortes, Madame la conseillère d'État. Nous avons le plaisir maintenant de passer à l'attribution des prix Latsis, en commençant par le prix attribué et sélectionné par l'Université de Saint-Gall à la professeure Miriam Buiton, qui a abordé des thèmes extrêmement importants et actuels, qui ont été d'ailleurs évoqués par Madame la conseillère d'État, le rôle des plateformes sociales, des plateformes digitales, dans la manière de façonner les opinions. Il y a une nécessité effectivement de prendre acte de ces évolutions préoccupantes et de pouvoir orienter ces plateformes de manière à les rendre non plus gouvernées par elles-mêmes, mais gouvernées par la société. Je vous laisse découvrir les travaux fascinants de Madame Buiton par une vidéo.
Platforms shape society, and we should make sure to shape those platforms and not let them determine us.
Online platforms have fundamentally reshaped social, economic, and political landscapes. Platforms like Facebook, Google, YouTube, TikTok, and Amazon enable users to discover unprecedented content, people, and products. Acting as powerful content moderators, these platforms rank and recommend information. A few dominant platforms wield considerable influence as de facto governors of the Internet, determining what content reaches and resonates with users. Buten's work aims to offer a broader reflection on the governance of emerging technologies and their regulation, and more specifically, to use this knowledge of how platforms work to determine their responsibility for user-generated content.
One major challenge is that this is a moving target. When I started working on this topic, many of the policy questions were just developing, and now we're at the point where several countries have already introduced new laws, and so we're at the point of implementing these laws. But meanwhile, platforms have developed and have changed, but also technologies are developing. So for example, we have new rules for social media, but in the meantime, generative AI came up, and we have deepfakes and other new problems. And so basically we have to constantly respond to how these technologies are evolving and how these platforms are changing their business models and their practices. So many different disciplines discuss platforms: business scholars, media scholars, lawyers, economists. And one of my aims is to bring all of these perspectives together and better understand what it really is that platforms do, how they influence our lives and influence society, and how lawmakers should respond to that, basically in order to build better, more responsible platforms.
This subject is all the more important given the growing impact of social media, especially on younger generations, who spend hours each day on these platforms and rely on them for information. At the same time, platforms have long escaped regulation, making it especially relevant to think about these issues. Consequently, platforms face increased pressure from governments to address these systematic problems. To cite a few recent examples, we can mention the EU investigating platforms like X, TikTok, and Meta for their handling of hate speech and protection of minors. Musk recently withdrew X from Brazil following demands to stop disinformation, and France arrested Telegram's CEO over the platform's role in facilitating criminal activity. When considering platforms' liability for harm on their sites, we should focus on their role as content moderators, rather than continuing to view them simply as technology companies or facilitators of user-generated content, as they have traditionally been perceived. In this fast-moving ecosystem, Buten's interdisciplinary approach integrates insights from law, economics, business, and media studies to comprehensively analyze platforms and advocate for effective regulation.
As a next step, we're starting to think about implementation of the new European rules. So what do these obligations mean in practice? How should social media platforms and online marketplaces change their recommender systems, or what measures should they take to better protect minors? And these insights we can hopefully use to also develop new rules for Switzerland, where we're awaiting a proposal to be published by the end of the year.
It is a great honor to receive the Latsis Prize tonight. It is also a great privilege to do research for a living and be able to think about problems and solutions and new ideas as a job. This prize comes at a symbolic moment for me because just 6 weeks ago I submitted my book on platform liability as my habilitation, and so hearing that I was going to be awarded this prize has been a great motivation. I have many people to thank. First, of course, the Latsis Foundation. Also my colleagues at the University of St. Gallen and the Center on Regulation in Europe for their constant feedback and discussions. Also many other academic friends for helping me develop new ideas. I'd specifically like to thank our Dean, Peter Hettich, for recommending me, our Vice Dean, Isabel Wildhaber, for joining tonight, my advisor from the University of Mannheim, Oliver Brandt, and of course my team for their assistance, especially my PhD student Jennifer Pullen. But I also owe a great deal of thanks to my friends and family. The past year, I must admit, has been mostly, or almost primarily, about finishing this book, many nights and weekends, and I couldn't have done it without their support. So thank you especially to my mother-in-law, Monica, and my mom, Ineke, for all their help taking care of our son, Philip, my close friends and my brother, Paul, for their listening ears, and my husband, Maximilian, for supporting me in my ambitions and cheering me on in everything I do. Thank you, and thank you also for joining tonight and making this a great evening. I really look forward to continuing this research. It's been a great joy, and thank you so much.
Le côté de l'École polytechnique fédérale de Zurich, un autre lauréate qui a été sélectionné, la professeure Yeon Chu, j'espère que j'ai bien prononcé votre nom, dans un domaine aussi extrêmement important pour la Suisse, pour les innovations futures qui se développeront dans un domaine extrêmement important, celui de la physique quantique. Et Madame Chu travaille en particulier dans la mécanique quantique, un domaine dans lequel la Suisse était vraiment à la pointe au niveau international. Et malheureusement, effectivement, le fait que la Suisse est écartée aujourd'hui des programmes européens rend cette situation un peu plus délicate qu'elle l'était par le passé. Donc on espère que la Suisse rejoindra bientôt les programmes européens, en particulier les flagships dans le domaine quantique. Vous allez découvrir les travaux de Madame Chu dans la vidéo. Merci beaucoup.
You know, quantum mechanics is the basis of a lot of technologies that we use nowadays, and our research is important to develop quantum technologies for the future.
There is now a worldwide effort and interest to harness the power of quantum mechanics to perform computations more efficiently, communicate information more securely, and measure physical quantities with unprecedented precision. However, many basic questions remain unanswered, such as, from what physical objects should these new technologies be made? How complex of a system can we build while still being able to control and measure its quantum mechanical behavior? Is quantum mechanics even applicable beyond a certain level of complexity, all the way to macroscopic everyday objects? These questions have driven Yuan Chu's research group at ETH Zurich to build devices that combine different quantum systems, as well as investigating the quantum mechanical behavior of massive mechanical objects.
Quantum mechanics is a really important physical theory that underlies a lot of our modern-day technologies. We use, for example, computer chips, lasers, MRI machines. And what we're doing is we're building the next generation of technologies based on quantum mechanics, right? Trying to really control individual quantum objects very precisely. By exploring these quantum mechanical properties, we can understand some fundamental questions. For example, whether or not quantum mechanics, which is usually used to describe simple things like atoms or electrons, can actually be applied to these more complex macroscopic mechanical objects.
One concrete example of an experiment performed by the group is the realization of a quantum superposition of mechanical vibrations in a 16 microgram crystal, making it the most massive object to exhibit such quantum behavior so far. On the more practical side, being able to create such complex quantum states in a mechanical object can be useful for quantum sensing. Because this crystal has mass, it can be used to detect forces such as gravity. The aim now is to define whether it can be used as a gravitational wave sensor whose sensitivity is enhanced by its quantum properties. Eventually, it could even be used to answer another big open question, which is how gravity and quantum mechanics can be unified into a consistent physical theory.
The next steps that we're looking at is taking these mechanical resonators that we're working with and interfacing them with new types of quantum objects as well. So, for example, electrical circuits, laser light. We're also looking at electronic spins in a solid-state material. We want to explore and be able to come up with new ways of processing, storing, communicating quantum information, which has the prospect of improving our computational efficiency or the security of our communications and things like that. Good evening, everyone. I would like to begin by thanking the Latsis Foundation for this great honor and for recognizing the importance of our research and for giving me the opportunity to thank the many people and institutions that made our work possible. So I would like to start with ETH Zurich, where I work, for giving me the resources to really perform all these interesting explorations of the scientific questions that you just heard about, and for providing me with some really amazing colleagues who are not only world-class scientists, but also very supportive people as well. In particular, I would like to thank Professor Atachi Omolu, who is my faculty mentor in the physics department, who nominated me for this prize, has also been a collaborator and a friend for a long time. Speaking of amazing collaborators, this prize really goes to the members of my research group, without whom, of course, none of this work would have been possible. People often ask me whether quantum computers will, one day cure cancer or steal all the money from their bank accounts. I don't know the answer, but fortunately, physics is an experimental science, and it is only through the hard work of people like these that we will one day know the answer. I would also like to thank our collaborators and our funding agencies, who you see on this slide, and I would also like to emphasize the European Research Council, whose excellent funding programs I hope in the future Swiss researchers will continue to have access to. So finally, I would like to thank my family, starting from the newest member, Anthony, who is just 3 months old. And however, he has already, how do I say this, motivated me to become much more efficient in my work. And last but not least, of course, my favorite collaborator in science and in life, Alex. I look forward to many more dinner conversations about clean room fabrication and broken cryostats and things like that. So thank you. All right, that's it from me. So thank you for being here and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Le prix Latsis pour l'Université de Genève a été attribué à la docteure Perrine Schumacher, qui a traité une question qui traverse l'ensemble des disciplines scientifiques, celui de l'intelligence artificielle, et en particulier des conséquences de ce développement pour le monde de la traduction, et évidemment les conséquences que cela a dans le domaine de la formation, comment est-ce qu'on peut demain former des étudiantes et des étudiants avec ce nouveau contexte de l'intelligence artificielle. Et vous allez découvrir les travaux fascinants de Mme Schumacher par cette vidéo.
Today, artificial intelligence is rapidly transforming the translation industry, and along with it, the way we train professional translators. That's why I'm deeply committed to conducting research with direct implication for teaching practices.
In recent years, the language and translation industry has been shaped by a technological boom, largely driven by the advent of AI tools, such as neural machine translation and lately, chatbots. As a result, the professional landscape is evolving rapidly, making the adaptation of translation training programs a critical and pressing need. In this context, Perrine Schumacher's work focuses on an ever-growing practice in the language services sector, post-editing. This process involves human translators reviewing, editing, and improving translations generated by machine translation systems. The aim is to ensure the translation meets the required quality standards, making it accurate, fluent, and suitable for its intended purpose and readership.
In my research, I investigate the impact of post-editing on text quality in an academic context. And I also assessed translation students' knowledge and perceptions of machine translation and post-editing. By doing so, I also hope to provide insights that can contribute to the ongoing discussions about updating translation training programs. One of the key findings from my research is the leveling effect on text quality in post-editing. This phenomenon means that students with weaker translation skills tend to benefit more from post-editing, while those with stronger skills are likely to produce lower quality results when post-editing.
She conducted 2 controlled experiments with translation students, comparing the outputs of 2 translation processes from English into French, human translation and post-editing. Her analysis integrated quantitative methods such as descriptive and inferential statistics and automated linguistic analysis with qualitative methods, including human quality assessment and linguistic error analysis. Drawing on her findings, she strongly advocates for the balanced integration of post-editing into translation curricula, emphasizing the development of informed and responsible use of machine translation tools.
Today, with the introduction of powerful and freely available generative AI tools like ChatGPT or Gemini, it is now possible to combine machine translation with increasingly efficient post-editing and paraphrasing technology. So if we want to meet the new challenges posed by these chatbots, we need to study their impact on the text quality and on the translation process. From there, we can explore how to integrate them effectively into the classroom, preparing the students to adapt to the evolving landscape of the translation industry.
Je voudrais tout d'abord remercier chaleureusement la Fondation Latsis pour cette reconnaissance prestigieuse et dire que ce doctorat a été pour moi un parcours, un véritable cheminement ponctué à la fois de moments de doute, de joie, mais aussi parfois de profonde remise en question. Et je voudrais donc remercier aujourd'hui toutes celles et ceux qui m'ont accompagnée de loin, de près comme de loin, dans cette aventure. Je pense notamment à mes collègues de l'Université de Liège et les collègues de l'Université de Genève, mais également aux étudiants et étudiantes qui ont été les cobayes de mes expériences. Je pense aussi à mes 2 promotrices, Valérie Bada et Pierrette Bouillon, qui ont vraiment été à la fois disponibles, toujours bienveillantes et très humaines. Donc elles m'ont vraiment inspirée et m'ont permis de mener à bien ce projet. Je les remercie. Et cette thèse n'aurait sans doute pas été possible non plus sans le précieux soutien de mon compagnon et de mes proches et de ma famille. Donc merci beaucoup à toutes ces personnes. Alors aujourd'hui, il me tient vraiment à cœur de continuer à poursuivre ces recherches en y intégrant les chatbots, donc ces outils fondés sur l'IA générative et dont les enjeux se situent dans la continuité des enjeux de la traduction automatique neuronale et qui interrogent une fois de plus l'avenir tant de la profession, tant de la traduction professionnelle que de l'enseignement de la traduction. Donc, puisque ces chatbots sont déjà librement accessibles aux étudiants et étudiantes, je pense qu'il est vraiment urgent de susciter et d'encadrer leur usage raisonné et responsable. Donc, l'un de mes objectifs sera de continuer à tenter de démystifier l'intelligence artificielle auprès des futures générations de traducteurs qui, on le sait, sont particulièrement sensibles au discours marketing dominant qui a tendance à embellir ces technologies et à surévaluer leurs performances. Donc il est vraiment essentiel, il me semble, de leur faire prendre conscience de leur rôle, du rôle toujours bien prépondérant et indispensable de l'humain, notamment dans le domaine de la traduction. Merci encore une fois à tout le monde. Merci.
Et finalement, le prix Latsis pour l'École polytechnique fédérale de Lausanne a été attribué à Mme Giulia Tagliabue pour des travaux extrêmement importants dans le domaine du développement durable, puisqu'il s'agit effectivement d'utiliser des nanotechnologies pour essayer de développer des nouvelles formes d'énergie et surtout de conservation de l'énergie. Et je souligne aussi en particulier l'intérêt de ces 4 lauréates qui montrent l'intérêt de la diversité de provenance géographique de ces 4 lauréates. Je vous invite à découvrir les travaux de Mme Tagliabue par cette vidéo.
I want to be able to contribute to the development of a sustainable energy generation and storage technologies and trying to develop solutions that can really impact the societies.
Nanophotonics aims to understand and manipulate the interaction between light and matter on a nanometric scale, allowing to redefine the transport and conversion of energy. Julia Taliabury's Nanoscience Laboratory for Energy Technologies focuses on optoelectronics, specifically the fusion of optics and electronics, with the goal of providing a disruptive approach to sustainable energy creation.
So we are trying to understand how, beyond confining light and bringing it to the nanoscale, how can we then use the energy of light for further energy conversion processes. And so we try to understand this in a broad manner. There are, let's say, three main pathways with which we can convert the energy of light. One is a photochemical process, so driving chemical transformation. One is through photothermal effects, so generating heat, very localized at the nanoscale. And another one is through electrostatic coupling with ions that are contained in a fluid. You can think about seawater that contains salt, and then we try to understand how we can manipulate this salt-solid interaction, which can also be used for energy conversion.
A concrete example of the practical application of this research is the creation of plasmonic photochemical devices that can generate valuable chemicals like fuels and plastic precursors in a manner similar to photosynthesis in plants. Consisting of metallic nanoparticles that strongly absorb light in a wide range of colours and are chemically active, i.e. catalysts, these nanodevices can help control the pathway of the chemical reactions thanks to the concentration of light at the molecular level, providing simultaneously strong electric fields, energetic hot carriers and thermal energy. The experiments carried out reveal fundamental aspects of the interaction between the absorption of light, the transport of hot electrons produced by light, and their transfer to molecules. Using light and metallic nanoparticles to steer chemical reactions could open a new pathway for the design of photochemical devices.
In the next steps of our research, we want to do two things. On one hand, we want to go deeper on some fundamental aspects, and in particular, understanding how the heterogeneity of nanomaterials impacts the energy conversion processes. And on the other hand, we want to take the fundamental understanding and the proof of concept devices that we developed and be able to upscale them to have a real-world prototype that we could test in real-world conditions.
Thank you very much for being here tonight. I want to start by acknowledging the Latsis Foundation for this great honor. And I want to mention that, as you've seen, we start working on these very small scale elements, and we try really to think about energy in a holistic manner because the energy problem is really diverse. And there are various aspects to it. There is the generation, there is the storage, but also there is the energy consumption reduction. And I think it's really by addressing all of these different aspects that we can make progress in this regard. And so, although we work at a very small scale and we are just one single lab, we hope that our work will be able to make a contribution to upscale this system and really come to systems that can be deployed. And so this, I think, is a responsibility of all, like in all small actions as individuals. And also, I want to mention that obviously this would not be possible just by myself. And for this, I really want to thank my team. It's a very diverse team. We all share our passion for research, and they have all worked very hard on this very interesting interdisciplinary project that really require all of them to come together with very different backgrounds and contribute each with the different aspect to be able to develop these devices and understand how they function at a nanoscale. I also want to thank our collaborators, local ones, international ones. It's a very wide network, and we would not be able to progress, in particular, without the contribution of several theoreticians that help us interpret and understand our experiments. I also want to thank the funding agencies here in Switzerland. They have been really instrumental to support our research. And so a really big thank to the Swiss National Science Foundation and also to EPFL that have supported us through some internal contributions. And I really want to stress that science is a community endeavor, so I'm here today to represent, as I said, my group, but I also want to thank my community more at large, the Institute of Mechanical Engineering, the Faculty of Engineering, and EPFL, because they have supported us and helped us address problems, find solutions, move forward. And all of my community of nanophotonics, they are extremely welcoming. I wouldn't be here today if some of my colleagues would not have supported and nominated me, so a big thank to them. And then before coming here, obviously several mentors have supported my path in science, and so I really want to say a special thank to two people who have played a key role in my scientific education. So my PhD advisor, Dimos Poulikakos from ETH Zurich, and Professor Harry Atwater from Caltech, that really allowed me to grow scientifically. And finally, obviously, in all these years of a lot of work, different countries, I would like to thank, obviously, my family and my husband for their support. Thank you.
Une nouvelle fois, félicitations aux 4 lauréates qui montrent effectivement la richesse de la recherche qui est faite en Suisse et puis les perspectives extrêmement importantes en termes d'innovation, la translation de la recherche vers des innovations tout à fait concrètes. Je vais présenter maintenant le conférencier de ce soir. Né à Londres en 1954 d'une mère romancière anglaise et d'un père avocat ghanéen, Kwame Anthony Appiah a grandi au Ghana et fait ses études en philosophie à Cambridge, avant de devenir professeur à New York University, avec un parcours académique assez impressionnant, puisqu'il a été dans les meilleures universités du monde, à Cambridge, à Yale, à Cornell, à Duke, à Harvard et à Princeton. Qui dit mieux? En tout cas, pas moi. Il est également chroniqueur au New York Times, ce qui traduit, je crois, sa volonté permanente de dialogue avec la cité. On en parlait d'ailleurs ce midi. Un dialogue si important pour créer la confiance en la science qui fait si souvent cruellement défaut de nos jours. Il a publié de très nombreux ouvrages, traduits souvent en français, qui démontrent aussi sa diffusion et sa reconnaissance dans le monde de la science, non seulement anglophone, mais également francophone. Parmi ses livres, je citerai en particulier Pour un nouveau cosmopolitisme, paru chez Odile Jacob en 2008, Le Code de l'honneur, édité par Gallimard en 2012, qui retrace une passionnante enquête sur les révolutions morales qui ont conduit aussi bien à l'abolition de l'esclavage et du duel en Angleterre qu'à la fin du bandage des pieds féminins en Chine. Son ouvrage publié en 2018 aux éditions W.W. Norton sous le titre « The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity » est aussi traduit en français en 2021 chez Grasset, toute ressemblance avec la situation actuelle dans le monde n'étant manifestement pas totalement fortuite. Le professeur Appiah est actuellement président of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Il a choisi de nous parler ce soir d'un thème qui transcende toutes nos sociétés, celui des identités. Comment ces identités se forment-elles et comment elles façonnent nos agissements, nos pensées et nos ressentis? Comment aussi elles peuvent créer parfois des conflits irréductibles, pour le pire, mais créer aussi parfois, pour le meilleur, une communauté riche de sa diversité identitaire. Professor Appiah, we are very much looking forward for your conference, which will be followed by a Q&A session with the public. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Let me just begin, before I turn to my text, by joining others in thanking the Latsis Foundation, both for celebrating these wonderful scholars whose work we've just heard about, but also, of course, for inviting me to join you here in Geneva today. And I'm honored and delighted to be here. And if I had a good memory, I would remember all the titles of the various people present that the rector mentioned. So I'll do it in the English way and say only, my lords, ladies, and gentlemen. So I'm going to start a long time ago. Long ago, Confucius saw that our responsibilities to other people depend on our relationships with them. We have distinctive obligations to our children and parents, our friends, and our rulers. Mencius developed the idea more systematically. As he said, between father and children there is affection, between ruler and ministers there is righteousness, between husband and wife there is distinction, between elder and younger there is precedence, and between friends there is faithfulness. Around the same time as Mencius, Aristotle recognized that your flourishing can depend upon directly on other people. As he put it, many noble actions require instruments for their performance in the shape of friends. Also, there are certain external advantages, the lack of which sullies supreme felicity, such as satisfactory children. A man who is childless and alone in the world is not our idea of a happy man, and still less so, perhaps, is one who has children or friends that are worthless, or who had good ones but has lost them by death. Indeed, Aristotle thought that the successes of our children, even after our deaths, can add to the measure of how well our lives have gone. Much more recently, John Stuart Mill argued that people had the right to fix for themselves certain elements of what was good for them, because, as he put it, individuality is one of the elements of well-being. As he says in On Liberty, if a person possesses any tolerable amount of common sense and experience, his own mode of laying out his existence is the best, not because it is the best in itself, but because it is his own mode. There are, in other words, elements of the human good that matter in assessing an individual human life only because the decisions of the person whose life it is has made them matter. Now, I'm insisting these ideas are canonical and not just in European philosophy and its heirs, because I want to argue today that there is a new idea in the contemporary world that helps to bring ideas like these into a single ethical vision. I think it's only relatively recently, in fact only since the Second World War, that a new notion, the notion of a human social identity, rooted in sociology and psychology, has allowed us to bring the sorts of ideas that I mentioned in Mencius and Confucius and Aristotle into a coherent picture, so bringing them more securely together. Now, I want to insist that I don't deny that people have always thought that various of the things we called identities were important in shaping our educations. Let me give you another example. That Man Shao, an early Chinese intellectual, in her Lessons for Women, written around 80 of the Common Era, says, let a woman not refuse to perform domestic duties, whether easy or difficult. That which must be done, let her finish completely, tidily, and systematically. So we too have ideas about the connection between gender and ethics, though of course they're different from hers. So what is it that's new? Well, I think it's the thought that gender, along with race, religion, nationality, and a bunch of other things, are things of the same kind. Before the 1950s, nobody would have said, oh, well, race is like gender, gender is like class, class is like religion, religion is like nationality. They wouldn't have thought of them as things of the same kind. That's the new thought. And that's the thought that the word identity crystallizes. So here's the picture. Each of us has many identities, and they play a part in defining for us what it is for our lives to go well. They are all deeply social, because their definitions and their meanings for us, as well as the way they affect how others treat us, are the subject of social debate and interpersonal negotiation. What it is to be a male or a female or non-binary, Swiss or Ghanaian or American, gay or straight or bisexual, is not settled by individuals for themselves, nor is it only settled by people who bear those identities. Some identities, as poets and philosophers, to give just 2 examples, we can adopt or reject. Though the fact that we call some, like these 2 vocations, suggests that they call to us, right? Vocare means to summon, to call, which reflects the fact that even these optional identities can sometimes seem unavoidable. But many are hard to escape. As trans and non-binary people often discover, most of us have bodies that generate expectations about our identities. And if we disappoint those expectations by refusing to act in the ways conventionally associated with those identities, we can pay a steep cost. So in sum, how our behavior is shaped by identity doesn't just depend on us. Often we do things because of our identities, adopting a view about what follows from them that is a social product. We use the social ideas that go with our particular identities to decide how to live. The clothes I wear, like my whole bodily comportment, are marked by gender and class, by ideas about gender and class. I could try to resist local norms of bodily movement. I could walk in a way marked as female, even though I'm a man. But others might well respond with puzzlement, insult, or assault. So however we ourselves identify, others have expectations based on their view of our identities. Still, whether our identities are optional or inescapable, we can adopt a variety of attitudes towards them. You can think of your gender as something with which you identify deeply, caring, as it were, to be a manly man or a feminine woman, or indeed an unmanly man and a masculine woman. Or you can wear your gender lightly, giving it much less weight in your practical life. Similarly, for some Europeans and Americans of African ancestry, like people like me, pride in race, especially given the adversities of racism, means that they identify deeply as black. Others, however, live their lives aware that others will think of them as black, and knowing that that will produce expectations, but caring relatively little about their racial identity. White people in Europe and North America, mostly not faced with racial adversity, routinely feel free not to think about their race most of the time. So even if an identity is inescapable, I have some control over what it means to me, even though I can't control the meaning given to it by others. And we can shape the more optional identities to some degree to our purposes. So there's plenty of scope for Mill's individuality in shaping our identities. In politics, identities play an especially important role in our dealings with strangers. A national identification, a sense of fraternity with tens or hundreds of millions of our fellow citizens, can motivate us to give of ourselves. In the extreme, it can lead someone to think, in a phrase that goes back to Horace, that it is a sweet and fitting thing to die for your country. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. So too people die for their faiths as martyrs, because their faith is vital to their sense of who they are. Though identities play many positive roles in our ethical lives, they also, of course, have pathologies. They can close us off from people whose identities we don't share, turning nationalism towards xenophobia. Over-identification with one label can close you off to solidarity with people with whom you share other labels, but you're forgetting for the moment. Conservatives or liberals or leftists can refuse conversation with fellow citizens whose politics they don't share. So while we must recognize identities play a crucial role in our social lives, we need to manage them carefully if their many benefits are not to be swamped by their potential costs. So in this lecture, I want to sketch a philosophical picture of what identities are and how they shape the ways we act and think and feel, and I'll suggest a few ideas about how to manage them for the good. Return for a moment, as I often do, to Aristotle. One of his best ideas was that there is an important subject, ethics, which asks the question, what is it to live well? What is it to have a good life? Aristotle said that people who lived well had eudaimonia. Sorry, I always botched that word because there are not much agreement about how to pronounce it in English. And I don't know how it was pronounced in classical Greek. Nobody does. But it's sometimes translated as happiness. This is not a great translation into modern English, since happiness now has the sense of a particular sort of positive feeling. But not everything about living well has to do with how you feel. So, like many philosophers, I prefer to translate eudaimon as flourishing, or as I did just now, to speak of living well. When people talk about ethics these days, they're often asking questions about what people owe to others. And if they talk about professional ethics, they're talking about the norms that govern roles in people's working lives, as journalists or teachers or doctors or scholars or as managers or employees of businesses or other kinds of organizations. These are certainly among the things that you must consider while you're deciding how to live well. A person who's living well is doing what they should for others, and in a decent job, keeping the norms of your role can be part of living well too. I prefer to call questions about how we should treat other people moral, reserving the word ethics for Aristotle's broader set of questions. Of course, part of what it is to live well is to treat other people well. But morality in this sense can't be all there is to ethics, because to live well, you have not only to do what is right for others, you must also take care of yourself and your own projects. So a plausible answer, I think, to Aristotle's question, what is it to live well, one proposed by my friend, the late Ronald Dworkin, in the spirit of Aristotle, is that living well means meeting the challenge set by three things: your capacities, the circumstances in which you were born, and the projects that you yourself decide are important. So each of us comes with different talents and is born into different circumstances, and we choose, to some degree, our own projects. So each of us faces a unique challenge because we face a unique combination of those three things. And what matters in the end is not how we rank against others, it's how we meet our own challenge. There isn't a comparative measure that makes any sense that enables an assessment of whether your life or mine is better, but there is a way of thinking about which lives would be better for me. And part of that challenge is recognizing our distinctive talents and developing our own projects, while, like the sort of projects that you four have committed your lives to, at least for the foreseeable future, but perhaps not forever. But we have to do that while respecting the legitimate claims on us of other people, including other people, but also maybe animals and maybe even the natural environment as well. So as I said, I think some of the great tools in living our lives are these social identities: gender identity, sexual orientation, national, cultural, racial, ethnic and religious identities, professional identities, which I just mentioned. Now, one reason I've spent as much time as I have reflecting on identity is that my own identity has frequently puzzled other people. In many places over the years around the world, I have been addressed by taxi drivers, and the scenario goes like this: a brown-skinned man gets into the cab and talks with a vaguely British accent, that's me, and the driver is brown-skinned too, and so they're often trying to see if we have some sort of affinity. So in Britain and in Abu Dhabi, there are South Asians who tried Urdu and Hindi on me. Just last week in Marrakesh, somebody asked me if I was Moroccan. The Parisian who thought I was from Belgium, an insult to my French accent, perhaps took me for a fellow Maghrebi, and in the last couple of years, a Sikh and an Egyptian in New York have wondered where I was born. Well, the answer to that question is, as you know now, in London. But that's, of course, not what they wanted to know. That was really a very unhelpful answer to the question. So what they meant to ask was, where did I come from originally? Or they wanted to know, what are you? Well, the answer to the question of origins, the where if not the what, is that I come from two families in two places far apart. By the time I was born, my mother had lived in London, often since her childhood, but her real home was far away in atmosphere, if not in kilometers, on the edge of the Cotswold Hills, where she'd grown up on a farm in a tiny, picturesque village, this is it, called Filkins. I'm hoping this will produce empathy, since I know Switzerland is full of tiny picturesque villages too. As a result, while my mother was a Londoner when I was born, she was at heart a woman from the West Country who happened to work in London, even though she had spent time during and after the Second World War in Russia and Iran and even here sometime in Switzerland. She found a job in London at an organization working for racial harmony in Britain and its empire. This was in the early 1950s, largely by supporting students from British colonies working in London. The organization was called Racial Unity. And that was how she met my father, because he was a law student from the colonial Gold Coast. He was an anti-colonial activist. He was the president of the West African Students' Union in London, and he represented Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who was to lead Ghana to independence in 1957, just a few years after I was born. So you could say she practiced what she preached. She practiced racial unity. The other side of my family then came from Ghana, more precisely from Asante, a region in the heart of the modern Republic of Ghana, where my father was born in Kumasi, its capital. My father's family, he taught us, could be traced back to a man called Akramampim, an 18th century general whose successes in battle had won him the right to a parcel of land on the edge of the Asante kingdom. As you see, this is a 19th century picture of Asante. That's because I can't find any 18th century pictures, but this is the earliest picture of Asante. This is the earliest picture of my hometown that I know of. It was drawn by a British soldier, a man called Bowditch, who went to Asante to visit. One of the things he did in his conversations with the king of Ashanti was give him a good idea. So when the British finally conquered Ashanti, there was in my hometown a museum modeled on the British Museum, because Bowditch had told the king of Ashanti about the British Museum and he thought it was a good idea. Anyway, all right, back to the 18th century. So my father raised us with stories of this family, but in a sense it wasn't really our family. It didn't belong to my sisters and me, because just as my mother's people, my English family, were patrilineal, so they thought you belonged to your father's family, my father's family, being matrilineal, thought you belonged to your mother's family. So I could have said to those taxi drivers that I didn't have a family at all, since my mother's family consigned me to my father and my father's family consigned me to my mother. Of course, as you'll anticipate, what actually happened was that both families happily absorbed us. And narratives like these shape our sense of who we are. Each person's sense of self is bound to be shaped by his or her own background, beginning with family but spreading out in many directions, to nationality, which binds us to places, to gender, which connects us, each of us, with roughly half the species, and to such categories as class, sexuality, race, and religion, which all transcend our local affiliations. I've been meditating on questions of identity for more than 4 decades now. I began with thoughts about race because I was genuinely puzzled by the different ways in which people in different places, like those taxi drivers, responded to my appearance. That wasn't so much the case in Asante, where by the time I came along, one local parent was usually enough to belong. And in fact, Jerry Rawlings, Ghana's head of state from 1981 to 2001, so the longest lasting Ghanaian head of state, had a father and a name from Scotland. He wasn't chosen by the people originally because he came to power through a coup d'etat, but his fellow countrymen eventually elected him twice to the presidency in elections, free elections. Unlike my 3 sisters, who were born, like my father, in Asante, I have never been a Ghanaian citizen. I was born in England before Ghana's independence with an English mother, and I showed up in Ghana at the age of 1. So I would have had to apply for Ghanaian citizenship, and my parents didn't apply for me at the age of 1. You're not allowed to make that decision for yourself. And so by the time it was up to me, I was used to being a Ghanaian with a British passport. The story in England was complex too. In my grandmother's village, Minchinhampton in Gloucestershire, that's me with my grandmother, where I spent much time in my childhood, those we knew never seemed to doubt our right to be there. My aunt and uncle lived in this picturesque little town in the west of England too. My aunt had been born there. My grandfather spent time at a house in the valley, which belonged to his uncle, whose mills had once been the largest supplier of cloth to the East India Company. And his father served as the Member of Parliament for Stroud, a few miles to the north, while my great-grandfather's great-grandfather represented Cirencester, a few miles to the east, in Parliament for much of the first half of the 19th century. So there were ancestors in that area, some buried in a Cripps family crypt in Cirencester Church, back to the 17th century. But the skins and the skins and the African ancestry that I shared with my sisters marked us out as different in ways we weren't always conscious of, I think, when we were children. I recall attending an event a few decades ago at a school that I had been to as a child, that school, and coming upon an elderly man who had been the head of the school in my day. "You won't remember me," I said as I introduced myself to him, but he heard my name, he brightened up and he said, "Oh, of course I remember you. You were the first colored head boy. You were the first brown-skinned head of school." So he remembered me, but he probably didn't remember most of the others. So I think when I was young, I guess the idea that you could be properly English but not white was not very common. In America, once I got there, things seemed at first relatively simple. I had an African father, and so like President Obama later, I was black. But the American story too is complicated and has changed over the years, in part because of the rise of the idea of mixed race people as an identity group. It's a new idea in North America, not a new idea in Latin America or in South America, but a new idea in Anglo-Saxon America. Color and citizenship, however, are quite separate matters. After the Civil War, no sensible person could deny that you were black. You could be black and American, at least so far as the law was concerned, because that's one of the Civil War amendments to the Constitution makes that plain. Now, that doesn't mean there hasn't been a persistent undercurrent of white nationalism in the United States. There has. But still, I hope it's clear why I might have been puzzled about how to make sense of other people's ideas about race when I was trying to fit myself in to the United States. And when I turned over the years to thinking about nationality and class and culture and religion as sources of identity and added in gender and sexual orientation, I began to see three ways in which these very different forms of grouping people do nevertheless have some important things in common. There really is a reason for thinking of them all as things of the same kind. And the philosophical task, of course, is to say what that is. Well, the first thing, though obvious, often goes unnoticed. Identities come with labels. So understanding identities requires first that you have some idea about how to apply the labels to people. Explaining to someone what Catholics or Frenchmen or working class people are begins with some suggestion as what it is about people that makes the label appropriate to apply to them. That way, you can look for someone of that identity or try to decide of someone you meet whether the label applies. Now, it's important that there's often no consensus about the boundaries here. Not everybody agrees, alas, that a Muslim can really be French, but there's usually some consensus about central cases. And these labels wouldn't work if we couldn't agree about any applications of them. So we have central class of cases where we agree, and then we have lots of cases where we have arguments. A lot of arguments now about trans people. A second point is that an identity matters for its emotions, for its members' emotions and their deeds. And one common way is that they feel some solidarity with others in the group. So their common identity gives them reason, they think, to care about and to help one another. And it creates what I've called norms of identification, ideas about how you should behave given your identity. But just as there's usually contest or conflict about the boundaries of the group, about who's in and who's out, there's almost always disagreement about what normative significance an identity has. What does being Swiss require of you? I doubt that this room, or any crowded room in the Swiss Confederation, could generate a consensus on that question. There's a third feature that all identities share. Not only does your identity give you reasons to do things, it also gives others reasons to do things to you. I've already mentioned an example. People can help you just because you share an identity. You hear a Swiss accent in Istanbul. The person is puzzled about how to find the blue mosque. You tell them, because, hey, we're Swiss. We're going to help each other. Well, at least we're Francophone Swiss. People can help you. That's one of the forms of treatment that goes with identity, is solidaristic behavior towards fellow members of the group. But among the most significant things people do with identities, one of the most significant forms of treatment is to use them as the basis of hierarchies of status and of structures of power. So in many places in the world today, and in the past, one ethnic or racial group regards its members as superior to others, assumes the right to better treatment, or it might be a religious group, as with Hindus in India. In some, identities come first with labels and ideas about why and to whom they should be applied. Second, your identity shapes your thoughts and feelings about how you should behave. And third, it affects the way other people. And all these dimensions of identity are contestable. They can be disputed. Who's really French? Who's français de souche? What should they do because they're really French? How they should behave, and how should you treat French men and women? So this little theory of identity that I just sketched, it fits on a single PowerPoint slide, makes it obvious why identities are important. For ethics, people's lives are made with and through these identities. So they both help fix what it is for you to live well, and they create resources for pursuing your life. Well, the philosophical task was to identify what identities have conceptually in common. That's done, that's my answer. But if that is what they are, it's important to understand some key psychological facts about them, which I've already done a little bit of in passing. Let me just offer 4 important pieces of psychology that seem to me crucial. The first is a key feature of the way we humans naturally think. Long before anyone instructs children to group people into categories, they're programmed to do it anyway. And one of our basic ways of making sense of the world is to form generalizations of the sort that linguists call generics. Generalizations like mosquitoes carry the West Nile virus, or tigers eat people. These generalizations qualify as true, though it's not easy to give truth conditions for them. It's not easy to explain what counts as true. For example, in areas where mosquitoes do carry the West Nile virus, typically less than 0.2% of them are infected. Only 20% of the bites of infected mosquitoes cause infection. Fewer than 1% of those will develop into the severe form of the disease. So note, under 0.0004% of bites typically cause serious problems. Nevertheless, we say mosquitoes carry the West Nile virus. Similarly, the vast majority of tigers have, of course, never eaten anybody. But we still say tigers eat people. Nevertheless, as the philosopher Sarah Jane Leslie has pointed out in a very fine dissertation on generics, which I had the privilege of examining once, one of the things she's pointed out is that when the property, so tigers eat people, the property of eating people, or the property of carrying the West Nile virus, when the property in question is one we have a strong negative feeling about, we're more likely to hold on to the generic. So these generics have another crucial feature. They encourage us to think of the class in question, tigers, mosquitoes, as a group with a shared essence, a hidden inner property that explains why the members are alike. Well, if you put those two findings together, we humans are more likely to essentialize people about whom we have negative thoughts. Negative generics are easier to form than positive ones. And they're more likely to recall thoughts about groups they've identified, they've essentialized. So the next time someone tells you that Muslims are terrorists, you can remember that that's part of the problem of generics. Even if 0.004% of Muslims were terrorists, many people would hold the thought that Muslims are terrorists, just as many people hold the thought that mosquitoes carry the West Nile virus. It doesn't just apply to generics about humans, it applies to generics in general. All right, so this tendency to essentialize people we talk about generically and to be more likely to recall negative facts about them is the first piece of identity psychology that I think matters a very great deal. Here's a second important fact about identities. One of the commonest things we do with them, as I said, is to use them as the basis of solidarity. People work together as Ghanaians, as Calvinists, and one of the things an identity can make you do then is help people whose identities you share. The third, again, very familiar psychological fact about identities, we have an in-group, out-group psychology that makes hostility to outsiders one of the easiest ways of building solidarity with insiders. Evolutionary psychologists think this helped our ancestors survive by creating groups they could rely on to deal with the perils of prehistoric life, which included other groups competing for resources. But these us and them instincts remain an indelible part of our inherited human nature. However, it's an equally important fourth, and for me, for the moment, final fact of social psychology, that working together with people of shared identity, as fellow Ghanaians, as fellow Methodists, say, doesn't require hostility to outsiders. It does not require it. It may be encouraged by hostility to outsiders, but it's not required. Indeed, we can come together as people of distinct identity, as Christians and Muslims and Jews, for example, to celebrate something such as interfaith dialogue, and to use that interfaith dialogue to work for peace among our groups. The Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa after the end of apartheid began with the distinct racial identities of the participants. They recognized each other as of distinct racial identities with different experiences with the South African state. They listened to one another, and then they went on to develop some new united projects. So we've got a story now about what identities are. There are ways of grouping people with labels, often contested. They play a role in how we think about ourselves and how we treat each other. And we've got a basic package of ideas about how identities work in our social psychology. They're central to human solidarity. We have lots of generic beliefs about our identities, some of which are pretty misleading. They lead us to essentialize groups of shared identity, assuming them to have much more in common than they do. We're particularly good at holding on to negative beliefs about identities. And though we're prone to treat people of other identities badly, we can also get along in the right circumstances with people while being alert to identities that we don't share. So if this is what our identities are, it'll be silly to be either for or against them. We're stuck with them, and properly mobilized, they're a great resource. Yes, they can get us into trouble, but they can also bring us together. We have to figure out when and how we should, and when we shouldn't, appeal to them. So now let me make a positive proposal for thinking about the moments when our identities divide our social and political lives, when in-group, out-group psychology dynamics go wrong. There is another fifth piece of social psychology that turns out to be helpful. Long ago, the psychologist Gordon Allport argued for what sociologists call the contact hypothesis. Roughly, it says that contact between individuals of different identities makes hostility and prejudice less likely if it occurs in a framework that meets a few important conditions. Critically, it must be on terms of rough equality, so living together as master and slave isn't going to help you get rid of bigotry. It must be in activities where shared goals are pursued in contexts of mutual dependency. So actually, competitive sports or armies. Good places for developing cross-identitarian solidarities and diminishing bigotry. And this is one reason that America's now racially integrated armed forces produce people who are less racist on average when they leave than when they arrive. There's good data on this. So, social psychology teaches us then that bigotry towards members of one's own community is something that can be both created and destroyed by the circumstances in which people live and work together. So, we need to find more spaces where people of our dominant political tribes build the social trust that allows tribes to cohabit while continuing to disagree about important matters. We need to be in conversation with one another across all our differences. Horace Murdoch, the philosopher Horace Murdoch, a novelist, once said something I cherish. Love is the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. Too many people today don't acknowledge the reality of others. They cannot see the world from any point of view but their own. They cannot love their neighbors, because they, let alone meet with them. So, and I want to give a small fictional story now that exemplifies what I think is needed to avoid this problem. It comes from the final episode of the first season of the British television series Skins, which is about a group of high school students in Bristol, in England. And there's a scene at the birthday party of one of the characters, Anwar, who's an English teenager of South Asian ancestry, whose father is a devout Muslim. Anwar's best friend in high school is called Maxi, and he's gay and white. And he's been waiting for Anwar to tell his parents that he's gay, which Anwar has been afraid, perhaps unsurprisingly, to do. So Maxi is standing outside, refusing to come into the party until Anwar tells them. And while they're having this back and forth, Anwar's father comes out and says, Maxi, what are you doing? I said, come on in. And my wife has made the curry you like, special curry you like. And here's what happens next, and I should apologize. This is a BBC program. The passage contains a word that I would have bleeped out if I knew how to bleep it out, but I'm sure you're grown up enough to handle it.
Maxi! Hi, Mr. Crow. You're just in time for the food.
Dad, Maxi's gay.
You've got a fantastic lambuna, you know? My wife made it because she knows how
Dad,
much you like it.
Did you hear me?
And the spices are just so hot, you know? Not too much, not too little.
I'm gay, Mr. Corral. I always have been.
It's a fucking stupid, messed up world. I've got my God. He speaks to me every day. Some things I just can't work out, so I leave them be. Okay? Even if I think they're wrong, because I know one day you'll make me understand. I've got that trust. It's called belief. I'm a lucky man. Right?
Yes, Dad.
Come, Maxine. The food's ready.
This is how things are with people who are in conversation with one another. Mr. Corral belongs to the Muslim tribe. Maxi's tribe is Christian, or perhaps post-Christian. But they don't have to agree. They just have to accept each other. And they can do that without a theory or a principle, because being together has generated commitments that can transcend even serious disagreement. Each recognizes, in Murdoch's phrase, that the other is real. This kind of cosmopolitan cohabitation is something we can all do if we want to. But we're only going to bother to take this step if we're already in conversation with one another. And that means sharing our thoughts and our lives, sharing thoughts about things we agree about, things we disagree about, Manchester United, that sort of thing, big things, small things, television shows, movies, the rumors about other people in the office or the dormitory. Mr. Corral begins in exactly the right place, with an admission that he can't work out everything, that the world is hard to understand, and he may not be right about everything. He doesn't abandon his belief that homosexuality is wrong. He puts it aside as something to be worked on later. Right now, what matters is celebrating his son's 17th birthday with his son's best friend. This works in practice. It doesn't need a theory. I am a philosopher. I like theories, but theory isn't the only thing that matters. I learned this lesson in my own life. My grandmother, like so many people, moved into a smaller house when she got older. Her new house became what her old one had been, my home in England, when I went to high school and university, because my parents lived in Ghana. And as a result, we got to know the people who lived moved into her new house, since they were now our neighbors, literally, across the street. My grandmother's late life friendship with these people was something of a paradox. He was an extremely right-wing member of the British Parliament. My grandmother, on the other hand, had married into one of the great English families of the left. Her father-in-law, my great-grandfather, was the first Labour leader of the House of Lords. Her husband served as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Labour government that built the welfare state after the Second World War. His aunt and uncle, Beatrice and Sidney Webb, had helped found the London School of Economics in order to think about to advancing progressive causes. Our new neighbour, on the other hand, had received a knighthood for his services to the Conservative Party in Parliament, and so he was called Sir Knox. Sir Knox's political views weren't just remote from ours, he was involved with politics that I regarded then and now as racist. Obviously, he wasn't personally racist, since he was extremely nice to me, but he was involved with racist policies about immigration, a topic that is still one in which racist attitudes play a large role. My grandmother, like me, my grandmother had by that time 4 non-white descendants, and more on the way, so obviously that wasn't her view. Yet relations across the street were more than cordial, and Knox took it upon himself to be a kind of mentor to me. He helped me pick out my college at Cambridge, his college, of course, Clare College, and then he drove me across England to visit it and to introduce me to the master and the fellows. Knox and Dorothy, his wife, hadn't had children, which may be why he wanted to do with me the sorts of things you might have done with a son or grandson. So it was he that taught me how to fish for trout. He also tried to show me how to box, because as an undergraduate he had boxed for Cambridge University against Oxford. That wasn't so successful. On the way back from the visit to Cambridge that set my academic path, so I became an undergraduate, a graduate student, a fellow, and now I'm an honorary fellow of Clare College, and that's all a gift from Knox. We argued for hours because Knox was about to vote on a bill in Parliament that would have reintroduced capital punishment, and I made the case passionately against, focusing, if my fading memory serves, on the horrors of mistaken executions. Knox, who had practiced as a lawyer, he was a QC, rebutted. And at the end of the journey, we arrived back in, that's him, we arrived back in Minchinhampton. That's Clare College. That's Minchinhampton. We arrived back in Minchinhampton, which was our home. It was my home and his home. And he said, genially and generously, well, you've won all the arguments, Anthony, but I'm still going to vote for the reintroduction of capital punishment on Monday. And he did. As I look around at the political divisions of the country that has become mine, I wonder what most of my fellow Americans would make of the sight of a young brown man with a great mop of hair and an elderly white man, me a subscriber to the Soviet news, the other as solid a conservative as Britain could produce, talking happily for hours about politics without one word spoken in anger or resentment. No voices raised. I've always realized I owed a great deal to our neighbor. As I say, I came to Clare College, which is one of the most important academic institutions of my life, as his sort of quasi-heir. But his greatest legacy was my knowledge that you can be friends with someone whose politics you think deplorable. That was his view of my politics, I'm sure, but it was and remained my view of his politics as we fished for trout or drove across England to Cambridge or chatted across the gate of Granny's cottage. I am as prone to irritation with the conservatives who are following Donald Trump down the rabbit hole of racism and reaction as the next East Coast liberal. But I am confident that I could become friends with many of them if we tried. And that thought gives me hope, that just as Knox and I could be friends despite our deep differences, just because we were neighbors, the many identities I share with so many other Americans of all political persuasions can allow us to find common cause even when respecting our divergent views about politics. It's the will to do that that's important. This, like the story of Anwar and Maxi, is an instance of the contact hypothesis in action. And my basic suggestion is that we need to work hard to create the connections across political identities that would allow the contact hypothesis to work to solve some of the many dimensions of our political polarization. There's a liberal fantasy in which identities are merely chosen, so we are all free to be what we choose to be. But identities without demands would be useless to us. Identities work only because once they get their grip on us, they command us, they speak to us as an inner voice, and because others, seeing who they think we are, call on us too. If you don't care for the shapes your identities have taken, you can't simply refuse them. They don't belong to you alone. You must work with others, inside and outside the group, so that the identities can fit you all better. And you can do that collective work only if you recognize that the results must serve everybody, must serve others as well as you. Now, all identities can become forms of confinement, but they can also give contours to our freedom, as feminist and working class and gay and lesbian and national and religious identities have done in struggles all around the world. They can expand our horizons to communities larger than the ones we personally inhabit. Without identities, nations are impossible. Why would I want to send money to people in Mississippi after a storm through my taxes if I didn't think of them as my fellow Americans? But that national solidarity is not the only grand level of solidarity, because our lives must make sense on the largest of scales of all, the human scale. Because we live now with more than 8 billion fellow humans on a small, rapidly warming planet. And the cosmopolitan impulse that draws on our common humanity is no longer a luxury. It's become a necessity. And in encapsulating that ancient ideal, let me draw on the words of a freed slave from Roman Africa, a Latin interpreter of Greek comedies, a writer from classical Europe who called himself the African. Here is how Publius Terentius Afer, Terence as we call him, writing more than 2 millennia ago, put it. Homo sum humani nihil a me alienum puter. I am human. I think nothing human alien to me. We need the many identities that distinguish us, but sometimes our shared humanity is what we most need. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Appiah, for this very fascinating talk and conference about identity. And I'm sure there will be many questions coming from the public. You can ask them in English or in French. There is a translation. So who would like to start? There is one question there, I think. Is there any mic?
Okay. Thank you very much for this inspiring lecture about identities. When you spoke about contact hypothesis, it reminds me of something which happened in Switzerland in 2014, is when we voted about a law to limit migration in Switzerland. And the interesting statistical result was that in areas of Switzerland with a lower percent of migrants, here the support for anti-migration law was higher than in cities in which the migrants are highly present. So it was clear that there was this bias, like people that do not meet each other, people of other identities, tend to have more negative feelings about that, and I would like to have a comment on this practical political example of contact hypothesis.
Okay, somebody else is controlling this microphone. I don't have to turn it on. Yes, well, look, that is an example, or looks like an example of the contact hypothesis, but of course, to know whether it is, you have to know on what terms those people in the places where there are a lot of migrants meet the locals. They have to be meeting them on terms of rough equality and engaging together in activities where they have to rely on one another. And I assume that that is true. That's sort of normal when people live in a place, that's the way in which they relate to one another, and so it's the way in which settled migrants relate to locals. But there's interesting other data about this sort of thing because there are places in the United States where there are places in the United States where there are not many migrants, where people are very pro-migrant, and there are places in the United States where there are not many migrants, where people are very anti-migrant. So trying to figure out the detailed social mechanisms by which these attitudes are formed is quite complicated. And I said what the contact hypothesis says in rough form, but the statement of the contact hypothesis in Gordon Allport's book, The Nature of Prejudice, goes on for several pages. So there are many things that he thinks are relevant to the exact circumstances in which contact of the right sort does produce a reduction in bigotry. And just to be clear, you shouldn't infer from the fact that somebody thinks there should be less migration somewhere that they're a bigot. I mean, there are good and bad reasons for being in favor of and against migration, and there are good reasons for having different views about exactly how migration should be managed. Canada and the United States have very different strategies for managing migration. The United States is basically the laws for access to American citizenship do to some extent involve work-related things, so academics can come pretty easily. But the main mechanism is family membership, whereas in Canada, the main mechanism is labor market needs. And these are reasonable. I mean, both of those things strike me as important. I think it's wrong. It would be wrong, for example, for any country to refuse marriage as a basis for migration, because the Universal Declaration says we have the right to marry people, and if a government forces spouses to live on opposite sides of a border, they're not recognizing that fundamental human right. But so there are things where I don't think reasonable people should disagree about what the rules of migration should be. But these are complicated questions in our world, and so I don't infer from the fact that someone thinks there should be less migration that they're a bigot. Though I do notice that many bigots are against more migration.
Thank you. Une autre question? Oui, volontiers. Une de nos lauréates. Ici tout devant, si jamais. Micro. Merci.
Thank you for your inspiring speech. I wanted to ask you about acceptance. My impression is that sometimes it's important to listen to others with different views or from different identities or groups, but at the same time, if we give too much space to ideas that actually are meant to exclude others, for example, through racism, we would maybe want to convince them, and it seems that everyone is putting their feet in the sand more and more, and it's harder to reach the other. So how much room do you believe we should give to those ideas? Should we accept them, or how can we try and convince others while also respecting their different views or their different identities?
So the kind of cohabitation that I was hoping for is not a matter of pretending to agree with people about things you don't agree about. Cohabitation with Muslims, for me, as someone who was raised as a Christian, isn't a matter of pretending to be a Muslim for the purposes of the conversation. It's a matter of, I think, being engaged with one another, first of all, about the things that even if you do disagree with someone about, I disagree with Knox about racism and immigration, but there are plenty of other things to talk about. And we agreed about lots of things. We agreed that we lived in a nice village. We agreed that murder was wrong. I mean, there were lots and lots of things we agreed about. And we also agreed that some things were interesting, like trout fishing. So the key thing, I think, is I told him for 4 hours that I thought he was badly wrong about capital punishment. That was consistent with our continuing to be in dialogue with one another, in conversation with one another. That's the sort of thing I have in mind. So I'm not in favor of, so if somebody, in the modern world, at least in the North Atlantic world, people don't normally claim to be racist. They don't accept that they're racist. So when somebody is racist, which lots of people are, a large part of the task is getting them to see why the attitudes they have are in some way problematic. And you can only do that with someone if you're enough in conversation with them that they might actually listen to what you have to say about it. And you can only do that if you also listen to them, making their arguments. But yeah, I think it's important to say that this is about, it's not about dishonesty, it's about honest engagement with other people. But because there are so many things that are, there are so many human things, so many of the things that Terence said were not alien to him, that there's always things to talk about with people, even if you disagree with them about, in some ways, the most important things. I mean, just, I think these things are often best thought about, as I've tried to suggest, sort of through stories. I grew up in Kumasi, in Ghana, when I wasn't in England, with Muslim cousins. So every Ramadan we went to break fast. Well, not every day, but we broke fast with them at the end of Ramadan, and we sometimes went to eat with them because my aunt was a particularly good cook. So actually going to her place during Ramadan was kind of a splendid culinary experience. And my parents were very devout Christians, and my uncle Aviv was very devout Muslim. So they disagreed about something important, right? It's an important question whether Islam is correct about the Prophet. And it's an important question whether Jesus Christ is the Son of God or just another prophet, right? Those are the things Christians and Muslims disagree about. And on both sides, both my parents and my uncle were convinced that they were correct about these things and that these were important things. But we ate together all the time. Their kids came to us for Christmas and so on. And so I knew you could grow up having a deep religious disagreement with somebody, but still loving them and eating with them and swimming with them and doing all the things families do. So now this is very hard to, this is the point about theory. This is very hard to give a theoretical account of. What exactly is my attitude? Here I am thinking that you're wrong about the fundamental nature of the universe, but still hanging out with you. This can be hard to make. I think Mr. Corral's thought, which is basically the expression of a form of what philosophers would call fallibilism, the recognition that I might be wrong, is a very helpful theoretical starting point. I think the most important thing philosophers teach in general education in our universities is fallibilism, is the recognition that knowledge is difficult, as you guys know. Knowledge it's not easy, it's hard to come by. And therefore it's not surprising that lots of people are wrong about lots of things. And that, I think, in a way helps you accept that there are people out there who are just wrong about all kinds of stuff. And that you're probably wrong about things that you don't know you're wrong about. And one way of perhaps finding out that you're wrong is by being in conversation with the people who think something else. That was one of Mill's thoughts about the value of free expression, was that we through free expression, we acquire the possibility of learning that we're wrong, but also we get a deeper understanding from listening to people who disagree with us of the structure of our own position. Maybe you don't change my mind, but you get me to see something deep about my own position.
Thank you, Ravi. One question there, just in front. Thank you.
Thank you for your lecture. So you define identity as a group, let's say a concept, but what do you think about the current rise of individualism over the last decades of people not joining, let's say, leaving, having, let's say, not doing politics, not going in groups or religious groups, essentially, yeah, people being individualistic?
Well, I think, so one of the important philosophical thoughts about identity is that our identities are a tool for the construction of our individuality. They're not, there isn't a choice between identity and individuality. You can't be an individual except by being the kind of man you are, the kind of American you are, the kind of gay person you are, and so on. And so I've never really understood why people wanted to oppose, but there is a kind of crystallization of identity which can get in the way of being yourself, right? Because if you and your society have very, very rigid ideas about what it is to be a man, for example, then you won't be able to be a man in the way in which you actually need to be a man, right? So that's what I meant by talking about holding identities with varying degrees of heaviness or lightness. Now, you know, how easy that is depends on the context, right? So it's ridiculous to say to an American slave, oh, hold your racial identity lightly. It's only because of your racial identity that you're enslaved. You can't expect Palestinians and Israelis to hold their identities lightly in the middle of the current conflict, or Russians and Ukrainians. But even Russians and Ukrainians are also lots of other things. And even now, a Russian and a Ukrainian can talk to one another if they choose. So, yeah, I think what Mill meant by individuality, which was, as it were, being in charge of your own life, requires managing your own identity. And we should give people the freedom to do that. And one of his criticisms of his own society was that Victorian England wasn't very good at that, right? That's why he was pushing for individuality. But it's wrong to think, I think, that the problem is identity. The problem is the mismanagement of identity and false ideas about identity. It's not, you won't solve the problem by getting rid of identities, right? And that's why we keep inventing new ones. Because the world changes and, you know, I mean, there are now people, I think, who have a kind of green identity, right? They think of themselves as ecological people engaged with the planet in that way, just as in the 18th century in England and other places, there were people who identified as abolitionists, right? So members, middle class and working class and people in England in the early 19th and the late 18th century identified as abolitionists. They thought of themselves as people who were committed to the ending of slavery, the slave trade and slavery. And they did things because of that. They stopped using sugar in their tea because sugar was produced by slaves. Imagine an English person drinking tea without sugar. That's a big commitment. And it came from an identification as abolitionist. So it wasn't just the abstract thought that slavery is wrong. It was a sense of that we are a community of people. We are abolitionists. We go to meetings together. The typical abolitionist meeting in England in the late 18th century lasted 8 hours. People listened to talk about anti-slavery talk for 8 hours. They just sat there and listened. And then they went home and they signed petitions. Something like 20% of the adult population of England eventually signed a petition against slavery. That's 1 in 5 adults. So it mattered to them in a different way from just some abstract proposition. And I think but that was a choice. There were people who weren't abolitionists, right? There were people who went on drinking sugar in their tea.
Another question there from another Laureate.
Thank you. It was a very interesting talk. One thing that struck me in your narration is also the fact that a lot of these stories come from the personal, direct contact with the other.
Yes.
So can you comment in this situation, in this modern world where a lot of the contact is actually virtual, so it's depersonalized, how that matters in the way we consider identity, and how can we go in the direction that you're suggesting in having more dialogue when we cannot have this direct interaction and know the other person?
Good. So the mechanism is one mechanism is interaction with people of other identities produces a changed attitude to the identity, which then applies to the strangers of that identity. So you teach me not to be sexist. I now relate to everybody in a non-sexist way, and I think about policy in a less sexist way. So that's one mechanism. Now, one question which those of you who think about the internet will be, I'd like to hear your views about, is is it possible to have that kind of interaction virtually? The kind of interaction that makes a difference. I mean, it's of course possible to have virtual interactions with anybody anywhere these days. So in principle, I could have interactions, especially because of machine translation, I can have interactions with Uyghurs in China. But is that going to build the kind of relationship? One thing is the contact hypothesis requires collaboration on things that matter. Talking, well, it's great, is not really collaboration on things that matter. But you can use the web to collaborate on things that matter, right? People have organized protests, demonstrations, movements. In the case of the Arab Spring, a lot of that was organized on the web, so it's possible. But does it build the kind of bigotry-destroying relationships? That's an important empirical question. But just to say something else about how identity matters to our relations with strangers, which I said is an important thing. Once you've got a sense of identification through some identity, then you can do things for people of that identity whom you don't know. I mean, American evangelical Christians send money to evangelical churches in Tanzania to help them build clinics. And all they know about them is that there are other evangelical Christians. And nevertheless, they send money and they send their children sometimes. Their children go and spend summers, building things and so on. So it's very important that identities have this macro dimension, this large-scale dimension, as well as the individual dimension. The individual dimension helps us to build the unbigoted attitudes, but then they sort of generalize, and you're less likely to be hostile to. I think is that what you were meaning to ask about? Yes. Good.
Merci beaucoup. Is there maybe one last question there? Thank you. Silianos.
I was wondering if I can be a bit critical.
Yes.
I think in order to understand your theses and the terms, I did not hear any definition of the terms. In other words, if you say you are racist, let's define what race is. I am a geneticist, so I can study your DNA and tell you if you are of African ancestry or European ancestry or Asian ancestry, etc. I can also study your DNA, or not yours, but a DNA, and say that this individual has Down syndrome. So in other words, the word race is, in your mind, perhaps the different ancestries, but in my mind, it could be people with Down syndrome have a different race because they can be identified unequivocally by a simple test. And that's why us in genetics, we eliminated the word race from our vocabulary. And once you eliminate the word race from our vocabulary, all the discussion about racism does not have any sense. So, in other words, if you like to teach people not to be racist in your mind, let's teach them that their races do not exist. And race is a construction of a phenotypic evaluation of someone or the genetic composition of someone. And of course, philosophers do not like statistics, but the environment that the example that you gave of the tiger is very simplistic statistics, I think, because you did not take into account what statisticians over 500 years, they define as Bayesian hypothesis, the prior probability. Yeah. I would argue that if you see a tiger and a cow, the probability to be eaten by a tiger is much bigger than the cow. So the statement of most people are statistically correct in spite of your naive statistics that you gave. Excuse me for my criticism,
look,
but I...
Okay, so there's a bunch of different things in there. So first, it is true that many people who use the word race think that it corresponds in an interesting way to a classification of the human population into a small number of biologically interestingly distinct groups. And that's not true. There's a large number of interestingly biologically distinct groups, and the ones that we pick out on the basis of phenotype aren't really, I mean, they're not really the most interesting from lots of points of view. But it seems to me it makes, it's wrong to infer from the fact that people have mistaken beliefs about what races are, and that there aren't really any biological races. It's wrong to infer from that there can't be any racism, just as it's wrong to infer from the fact that there aren't any witches that people can't be persecuted as witches. Racism is about the people treating people without proper moral regard, because you think of them as belonging to a race. Whether they belong to the race or not doesn't matter. What matters, what makes something racist, is the concept under which you think of the person with whom you have to whom you have the morally inappropriate attitudes. On the generics question, people have tried to develop probabilistic accounts of the semantics of generics, and they haven't succeeded. So I'm skeptical that your approach would work. Since my dissertation was about probabilistic semantics, I do know a little bit about probability and Bayesianism and so on. As I say, people have tried the strategy that you're suggesting, and I don't think it works. I mean, as I said, it's very hard to give an account of the semantics of generics. I don't have one. But I'm pretty confident that the sort of probabilistic account you make wouldn't work, in part because, you know, I mean, I don't know how you would apply your approach to tigers to the mosquitoes case, but basically, you know, a lot of things are much more dangerous than mosquitoes in relation to the West Nile virus. So, I mean, I can see what you're suggesting, but I think it actually wouldn't. That particular proposal has been examined and rejected. So it's not that I have a positive account of generics, but I'm pretty certain that is because all the accounts I know of are wrong. I'm pretty certain that one's wrong too. But anyway, I mean, it's an interesting idea, and there are things you could try to do to make it work. But I think the key thing about the first thing you said is that, I mean, I became famous in the way academics become famous, so 300 people got interested in my views, for defending an eliminativist view about race and saying that races were not biological. And I thought that was obvious, because before I was a philosopher, I was a medical student, so I knew a fair amount about genetics and evolutionary theory. But it turned out that people were very puzzled by this claim. So I spent the first 10 years of my career, I suppose, trying to explain to people why I thought that. But I think it doesn't help you get rid of racism to say there aren't any races to have the attitudes to, because people have attitudes to people on the basis of race, even though there aren't any races. And it turns out to be incredibly hard to stop people thinking in these terms, in part, I think, because of generic thinking. Because people store away generalizations on the basis of easy to categorize things like phenotype. They store them away. And it's just very difficult to, once you're doing it, it's very difficult to get you to stop. I think a more successful strategy than simply declaring races to be unreal, which I'm happy to do if you agree with that, is to get them to think in other terms. It's not to tell them not to think in that way, it's to start them thinking in other ways instead, in terms of other forms of classification. And that...
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if there is any other question. If it's not the case, I will give a huge applause to Professor Appiah for this very inspiring conference. I'm not sure that we have been able to answer all the questions that are raised by this conference, but what is very clear for me is the fact that in the future, this challenge will be one of the most important for our societies. How to keep our identity and at the same time be able to develop some common projects. And if you look around, I'm a little desperate to see that a lot of countries, it seems that they are no more able to create this kind of common development of common goals. Maybe Switzerland will be one case that be a very important example where we can live together, have a common goals, and at the same time keeping our identity, even some kind of different identity. So thank you very much again. Merci beaucoup pour votre présence, toujours chaleureuse et importante pour la Fondation Latsis. Et je vous donne d'ores et déjà rendez-vous l'année prochaine avec de nouveaux lauréates, j'espère, et lauréats du prix Latsis pour les universités et les autres écoles de Suisse, et avec un nouveau conférencier l'année prochaine. Merci beaucoup, je vous souhaite une très bonne fin de soirée. Merci infiniment de votre présence.